Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth, and today I'm going to be responding to a question that I actually received yesterday, and I started the conversation there, but wound up going to bed early, and so I didn't finish it. I apologize for that. I'm getting around to it now. The person said, John, addressing me, relative to Romans 12:20, what is the meaning of heap coals of fire on his head? And at least in the circles that I travel in, that's not a major point of dispute. It's not a major topic of discussion. So I was kind of trying to figure out where this is coming from. So I said, interesting question. What prompted this? He said, a minister indicated that it meant that the enemy would then carry that situation from house to house with him. An example, or light or positive. I'm not sure exactly what that line meant. He said, like to know your studied perspective. Well, I'm not exactly sure how studied my perspective is, but I'll go ahead and give it a shot. Let's go ahead and bring up some Bible verses here. When it comes to the issue of how the Bible uses the phrase burning coals, because that's what it's talking about, heap burning coals on their head, the image of the burning coal in the Bible gets used in a few different ways, but two primarily. On one hand, it can be used to symbolize something that purifies. So, for example, in Isaiah 6:6, it says, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. He touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. That is a fairly famous passage that a lot of people know of that uses the image of the burning coal, and in this case, it's used to symbolize purification. That's not all that interesting. Another very similar example occurs in Matthew 24:11, where the author is instructed, then set it empty upon the coals, that it may become hot, and its copper may burn, that its uncleanness may be melted in it, its corrosion consumed. Again, burning coals are used as an instrument of purification. And in the Hebrew mindset, when they came up with images, it was usually very physical images that really played out in real life. They're usually based on very concrete ideas. So the idea of setting something on a burning coal, or taking a burning coal and simply setting it on something, could be used to purify it. The heat would, in the case of biological things, it would sanitize them. In the case of things that were metallic, it would cause the impurities to come out, so on and so forth. Very, very, very concrete imagery for the Israelites, the vast majority of the time, very concrete imagery. And that's the case when you're talking about either taking coal and setting it on something, or setting something on the coals. Okay, where it's just a simple, direct, put it there, let the heat of the coals do their job. But when we have the coals actively moving, though, the imagery changes a little bit. So an example of that one would be in Psalm 140:10. I'm going to start reading in verse 9. It says, as for the head of those who surround me, let the mischief of their lips overwhelm them. Let burning coals fall upon them. Let them be cast into fire, into miry pits, no more to rise. Let not the slanderer be established in the land. Let evil hunt down the violent man speedily. In this case, we have the burning coal image used again, but in this case, it's not for the purposes of purification. That is, the object to which the coals are being applied here is one that is destroyed. And just looking at verse 10 specifically, it says, let them be cast into fire, into miry pits, no more to rise. That's the qualification that follows up on this. Letting burning coals fall upon someone in this sense was the idea of burying them in fire. It wasn't setting the coals just simply on top of them and then being able to pull it out. It wasn't, taking the metal and putting it on the coals to purify the metal. No, this is an overwhelming image. This thing has been put in the fire and it's going to be destroyed in the fire. And this is the kind of imagery that we have at use in Romans 12:20. So let's go to Romans 12:20 and take a look at what it has there. We're going to get a little bit of context here. Let's start with verse 19. Paul instructs his listeners. He says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" This passage that we're getting into verse 20, is a passage that is talking about vengeance and avenging oneself, and saying that it is not proper for the Christian to do it for himself. God will do it, but the action will be carried out. It's not to be carried out by us, but the action will be carried out by God. In verse 20, it says, "To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will For by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. For some reason, I cannot read or talk today. I apologize. Saturdays, they drain every ounce of meaning from you. But anyways, that's the context of the passage. And in light of Psalm 140 and passages like that talk about heaping burning coals on someone, the idea is that this, in some way, shape, or form, is going to contribute to their destruction. That is the immediate context. That's the context of similar passages in the Bible that would use it this way. Yes, there are cases where burning coals are used as an image of purification, but that is in the case where something is set on the coals, or the coals are set on something, not heaped upon. The heaping upon kind of imagery, where it's thrown upon, showered upon, that is being buried in the heat, being destroyed in the heat. That's what's at play here. So in context, the idea is that when you do good to those who are doing evil to you, what you're doing is you're basically increasing the judgment upon them. That is, if I, switching over as being the evil person, if I, as the evil person, continue to do evil when I'm only repaid for good, the amount of evil that I'm doing is increasing. I'm heaping judgment upon myself. And that's what Paul is saying here. Don't do something that would contribute to your own just punishment. Instead, do only good so that they may contribute to their own just punishment. Let it be upon them, not upon you. If evil is going to be done that needs to be punished, let them be the ones doing evil, let you be the one doing good, so that nothing can come back on you. And in fact, your doing good means that the evil that they're doing is all the worse. It's one thing for somebody to strike someone else and that person to strike back, and so on it goes. Okay. The person who did the initial striking, probably in the wrong, depending on the particular situation, but generally speaking would be in the wrong, especially to strike someone without provocation. But if the other person is fighting back, well, past that initial point, there might be some justification for defending themselves at that point. But if you continue striking someone and they don't strike back, it's really clear who's in the wrong. And every time they're struck, the judgment against them is just heaping up. That's the concept here. This is in the context of God saying that vengeance is mine, I will repay. And also how we are to deal with evil, that we don't repay evil for evil, but repay evil with good. Okay, so back to the alternate interpretation that was given, that was said that the enemy would then carry that situation from house to house with them. There isn't really any good biblical reason why you would suppose that is true, that, this good thing has been done to this person, so they're going to go out and start doing good. Doesn't necessarily follow. Now, perhaps if God is gracious, that person will repent of their wicked ways, and God will use the kindness of the person that they were trying to persecute to break their heart. before him. That's all possible, but that's not what is immediately in the context of the passage. In the immediate context of the passage, it's talking about God being the one to avenge, and our attitude towards people who are doing evil to us. There's nothing in the passage or in other uses of the phrase of heaping burning coals upon someone that would suggest that the other person is going to be changed for the better by the situation. The only context that exists out there for that particular usage, when you have someone being buried in the coals, is that this is for their judgment, for their destruction. It's not purification. It's not something that is getting reapplied or anything like that. The context, biblical context, is very clear that this is a judgment motif. This is about increasing the other person's in judgment and keeping yourself free and clear. Now, as to this particular minister, I don't know. And, I imagine, like most ministers, who probably had good intentions in saying this. But biblically speaking, there just isn't any basis for it. Now, sometimes ministers, they'll go and they'll read something online here or there or elsewhere. And, and sometimes when it comes to the Bible, they'll get a hold of something that is supposedly Hebrew source material and whatnot. And they wind up getting themselves in a lot of trouble. First of all, a lot of the stuff that you get online, as far as primary source documentation, it's almost non-existent with a lot of it. And then when it comes to the whole, well, this is how the Hebrews would have understood it thing, you have to take that with a grain of salt. When it comes to our knowledge of Hebrew culture and understanding, a lot of that documentation comes from after the time of Christ, from documents such as the Talmud and those kinds of things. A lot of it comes from well after the time of Christ, or frankly from non-inspired sources like the Apocrypha, and represents, yes, what Israelites may have believed at this time or another, but not necessarily what was meant by the biblical authors. And a lot of times when people use Hebrew sources to try to figure out what something means in Hebrew interpretations, more often than not, it's the interpretation of some rabbi who lived hundreds of years after the fact, who is trying to create an understanding, and usually trying to create an understanding that is not going to coincide with Christianity, because by that point, Judaism and Christianity had made a very hard break from one another, and the Jews actively tried to discourage understandings that would be in conformity with the Christian understandings. And to a certain extent, the same thing kind of happened on the Christian side, where if anything, kind of smacked of being Judaistic, then they would usually put the kibosh on it pretty quickly. But that animosity wound up leading to several interpretations that were not overly useful. But the long story short is that, no. The idea that this is about what would happen to the enemy, that is the focus, that this is, about changing the enemy in some fundamentalistic way, that's the point of emphasis is just wrong. Biblically speaking, as per the context of Romans 12, the context is about keeping yourself pure when evil is done against you, and about letting God be the one to avenge. It is not, the emphasis is not on the enemy, but rather how you deal with the enemy. And the biblical context for burning coals being heaped upon someone, thrown upon someone, showered upon someone, however you want to phrase it, that biblical context is always towards that person's destruction. There is not a single biblical example where that doesn't happen. Like I said, there are cases where coals are used for purification, but that's when something is either set on the coals or the coal is set on something. It's a much more passive image. This is the one that we're talking about in Romans 12, much more active, doesn't get used that way. So yeah, a lot of analysis there. Hopefully it wasn't too bad, but long story short, this idea that heap coals of fire on his head means that the enemy would carry the situation from house to house with him just does not have any justification in the biblical literature itself. and any of the extraneous literature that someone might appeal to probably comes well after the fact and doesn't have a whole lot to do with the situation itself. That's my analysis of it. Take it for what it is. Thank you very much for your time and attention.